4 experts on our panel that represent a range of scientific, management, education, and citizen interest and activities. For these 3 sessions, tonight's April 23rd and April 30th, we can offer professional development points for educators. And if you're interested in that, you could see Terry or Tracy. It's called PDPs. But it's a nice aspect for educators to get some continuing education credits for these efforts. There will be no session next week because it's school vacation week. And then on April 23rd, we'll continue a panel discussion on coastal erosion issues. And the final panel discussion in the series will be on fisheries and aquaculture issues on April 30th. So let me take this time to introduce our panel members. First here is Maggie Geist. Maggie is the research translator for the McCoy Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, and she's filling in for Joe Costa tonight, who couldn't be on the panel tonight, and she did so with very short notice, so I appreciate Maggie's interest in stepping in at the last minute. Brian Howes is next to Maggie. Brian's a scientist in the biology department here in Woods Hole. He coordinated the Falmouth Coastal Pond Watchers program, and he's had a long-standing interest in both the science and management aspects of nutrient inputs to coastal ponds. Next to him is David Palmer, who is one of the volunteers with the group FACES, which is the Falmouth Association concerned with estuaries and salt ponds, and David will present the perspective from a citizen. And finally, at the end of the table is Brett Lamb, assistant planner in the town of Falmouth, who we're unfortunately going to lose to Keene, New Hampshire pretty soon, before the end of this month. But Brett's going to present an overview of the historical aspects of land use planning in the town of Falmouth. And so without further ado, Brian will lead off the panel. And I asked each panelist to spend about 10 minutes talking on their perspective of the issue as related to coastal ponds, nutrient impacts, nutrient management, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions following the presentations. Brian?
Okay. Well, as Judy said, I'm a scientist here, and you might ask yourself, how does a scientist get involved in management? And the basic reason that I'm involved in my research group is involved in ecological management of coastal ponds is because when I started doing this in the mid to late 80s, it became clear to the National Science Foundation and to the Office of Naval Research and to NOAA and EPA and a whole bunch of other basic research groups that indeed what had happened over the years is a lot of groups that stood at the shore of the ocean and looked out to sea and said, we will fund research on that. And a bunch of other researchers stood at the shore and faced inland and said, we will fund research on that. And no one really had done a significant amount of ecological biogeochemical research on the coastal zone itself, that narrow fringe. This has spawned, that land-sea interface now has spawned one of the hottest research areas over the last 5 to 10 years in the United States, trying to fill in that gap. You can say, well, what got their attention? Was it the scientists finally got their attention? Well, in fact, no. What got their attention is the issue that I'm going to be talking to you about tonight, which is coastal eutrophication. There was a deterioration of large sections of the nation's coastal waters, and the deterioration was such that it could not be missed by anyone, and it was sort of like the public hue and cry about what is going on here, which then has spawned the secondary effect of the ecological and biogeochemical research. And in fact, that's how it really happens. How it happened on the national level, and that's how it happens on the local level as well. We do what we like to think we do when we're talking to funding agencies anyway. We want to sound like big cheeses. We say we're doing scientifically based ecological management. Really what we're just trying to do is understand how the coastal ponds work so that we can figure out when they go wrong how they're broke, and if they're broke, then how to fix it. And if they're not broke, then don't fix it. We're the green. The scientists operate in the green. On the national level and local level, local concerns tend to drive, hey, there's a problem. Then we get called in as scientists to try to figure out, is the problem man-made, is it natural, or is there a problem at all? That tends to go then to us doing research monitoring that doesn't involve outside people. It's pure research. We're out doing state-of-the-art measurements. If the needs say that there is a problem, then we will do quantitative ecosystem level studies. These tend to take a relatively long time and tend to employ the most up-to-date research tools possible. Again, in the coastal zone, since there was very little known in the coastal zone about biogeochemical effects on coastal ecosystems, what happened was that there was a large, rich field to mine for basic research. And that's what I am, in fact, is a basic researcher. But once we get through these quantitative studies, what happens is we feed directly into policy people like Rhett over there and Maggie. And what we have is then managers, we will feed information into them. They will ask us questions. We will try to give them quantitative answers so they can come up with resource management plans. One of the unique things about Falmouth is that when those plans are implemented, either they're implemented to conserve an environment that's in good shape, or they're implemented to fix an environment that's broken. What has not happened in Falmouth, which has happened every place else, it stops there. We go away. We feel good about ourselves. We fix the environment. In Falmouth and in southeastern, it's actually overall with the Buzzards Bay Project. What has happened then is we have followed it up with finding out, did the resource management plan work? And that's where citizens monitoring comes in, and then continued scientific input. And we keep cycling through. We make plans, we implement them, we check them, and then we refine them. And that is sort of how this panel works together, and that is how science fits into management. As I said, the problem that is going on in the coastal zone is throughout the coastal waters of the United States. In fact, it's throughout the coastal waters of the world. Probably the largest coastal problem in the world today is coastal eutrophication. You can worry about it in Little Pond and Falmouth. You can worry about it on the western shelf of the Black Sea. The causative agents are the same. The impacts are the same. The losses of fisheries habitat and infaunal communities is the same. The scales are different. The places in the world are different. But what I will tell you about eutrophication is the same in Little Pond or in Waquoit Bay as it is throughout the world's coastal oceans. And the problem is eutrophication. It's a fancy word for nitrogen overloading or over-fertilization of coastal waters. Nitrogen is a natural part of the environment. If there's no nitrogen in the environment, then the plants can't grow. If you take all the nitrogen out of your lawn dies. You fertilize your lawn grows. Unlike your lawn, though, you throw a lot of fertilizer in a coastal pond, and you can get too much production. And that's what eutrophication is. It is the negative effects of too much production resulting from too much nutrient input. It's easy to say, it's easy to talk about low nutrient loads and high nutrient loads. Years ago, when I was an undergraduate, many years ago, we could talk about low and high nutrient loads. In the last 20 years, what we've been pounding our heads against the wall is that it's easy to write in a technical journal a low nutrient load or a high nutrient load, but unfortunately engineers and managers need to know how much nitrogen. And that's our job, is to do quantitative studies to determine how much is low and how much is high, because how much translates into how many houses, how many sewers, how many roads. In any case, under low nutrient loads, it's really not defined by how much goes in, but what the effect is. If you go out and you look in a coastal embayment and you find plenty of oxygen in the water, diverse fish communities, diverse animal communities, eelgrass beds, the result, if you go back and look, you will find that has a low nutrient input. And the environment would be, by any person in this room, you would look at it and you say, yes, that's a healthy environment. Under high nutrient loading, what happens under the highest levels of nutrient loading is, in fact, you lose your eelgrass beds, you lose your infaunal communities, and you lose the oxygen in the water column. And in fact, you can have hydrogen sulfide, which is that rotten egg smell, right up into the water column. This can happen on big scales. It can happen, again, in Little Pond. It can happen in Oyster Pond, where it has happened. Losses not quite as bad as this can happen throughout Boston Harbor and, of course, Black Sea and other places. The mechanism is nitrogen inputs cause increases in plant production. If there's a little increase, that could be a good thing, but when there's too much, then when this organic matter dies and decays, you get low oxygen conditions, and it is the low oxygen that kills things. If I shut off all the air from this room, we knock the oxygen concentration down to about 2%. I'm sure that we would all be very uncomfortable, while animals in the environment feel the same way. The only problem is that in this room there's a lot more oxygen in the air in this room than there is in water. Well, where do these nutrients come from? Nutrients in this area of the world, and in fact most areas of the world, we break them into point sources and non-point sources. The nitrogen is the same. It doesn't matter where it comes from. We divide them into point and non-point sources very simply because, for the brilliant reason that we can see point sources, they tend to be isolated. You can see them, you can measure them. We've been known about them for many, many years, and they tend to be well quantified. More recently, non-point sources, you hear it a lot now. 10 years ago, you didn't hear it that much, but non-point sources tend to be diffuse, like everybody's septic tank in their backyard, all combine up to be non-point sources. Agriculture, diffuse agriculture, road runoff tend to be non-point sources. But nonetheless, nutrients from sewage outfalls or agriculture or fertilizers or septic all eventually end up in coastal waters. And when they enter into coastal waters, unless they are denitrified at the sediment water interface, what happens is they will enter into the phytoplankton, normal phytoplankton, death, grazing, fish, clams, that kind of cycle, which is a good thing unless there's too much in the way of nutrients again, and you start ending up with oxygen problems. Just one example from Little Pond here. We can do it for all the embayments of Buzzards Bay and all the embayments in Falmouth, in fact, is looking at the relative sources of new nitrogen. New nitrogen means that that's nitrogen entering the environment from the land or from rainfall. And in Little Pond, what we find is a very classic situation for this region, that almost 3/4 of the nitrogen enters Little Pond through groundwater, and only about 1/4 enters in through surface water. And for almost all of the Cape, that surface water really, a lot of it was groundwater that then has just broken out to the surface of the land and run across the land a little early. For Little Pond, virtually 100% of the nitrogen which enters into Little Pond is from septic systems. In fact, for most of our coastal waters in southeastern Massachusetts, and certainly for most of the smaller embayments, the major source of nitrogen to the embayment is septic systems and runoff from impervious surfaces. So that's the major input. It is not cranberry bogs. It is not road runoff. It is not your neighbor. It is your backyard. And for Falmouth, we have sewers in Woods Hole and in parts of Falmouth. And in fact, what we do then is we ship it all to West Falmouth Harbor's watershed, where we put it through a treatment plant which doesn't remove the nutrients too much. It does do some nutrient removal when the tertiary portion of the plant is working, but when the lagoons are working, it's just like a giant septic tank. And in fact, the new outfall going into Buzzards Bay from New Bedford at $100 million is also not removing nutrients either. So when we build treatment plants, we're not necessarily removing the nutrients, we're changing other things. So what we're really trying to control then is nitrogen, and as I said, really nitrogen's not the issue, it's oxygen, and how it gets there is nitrogen comes in from the land, it's then swept out to sea. Loading is the combination of how much goes in and how fast it's emptied out. If the flow out of an embayment is very slow, then you don't need much going in to build the level up. If the flow out is very fast, then you need a whole lot coming in to build the concentration up. Nitrogen affects carbon, which is just plant production, and plant production affects oxygen through water column respiration, sediment respiration. We get some oxygen from the atmosphere, and oxygen is what controls infaunal communities. And that is what drives scientists crazy. We are trying to understand small changes in this that control that, and it's several steps away. And it's what really drives us crazy. We were writing nitrogen management plans to control infaunal communities, but The nitrogen itself is not the causative agent. The carbon that's produced is not the causative agent. It's the oxygen effects of the carbon and everything else that's a causative agent. So when you're trying to figure out how come those scientists can't figure out what's the right nitrogen level, if it was as simple as nitrogen was toxic and you added it in and it killed things, it would be a lot easier. Well, oxygen, the problem with oxygen, and just developing that a little further, the problem with oxygen is it changes. You can get oxygen from the atmosphere, you can get oxygen from plants, you can take oxygen up in the sediment, animals breathe oxygen, you have all these different factors which are controlling the oxygen pool in the environment. And this is just to give you an idea of how transient low oxygen events can be. This is just a 2-day period where this is about noontime. Oxygen levels, this is a great oxygen level. If all the embayments in southeastern Massachusetts had that oxygen level all the time, we would not be sitting here tonight talking about this. We'd be talking about something else. The problem is that during the night what happens is that over a course of a few hours you can have oxygen depletions down of that's about a third, but it actually can go all the way to 0. You can overnight go from a perfectly healthy looking environment to about 7, 8 o'clock in the morning, oxygen is gone, and then it builds up again during the daytime. What that means, if you go out and look in your embayment at noon or at 3 o'clock in the afternoon after lunch, you had a lunch meeting, you decided to postpone your sampling, you go out at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you can't figure out why all the fish are floating on the surface. And the fish are floating on the surface because 6 hours before in that same embayment there was no oxygen in the bottom water. So it's very transient, short-term events, again, which drive us slowly crazy. The effect of things like that, and the example of the real impact, just to drive it home in your mind of what low oxygen caused by eutrophication, caused by nutrient inputs can do to an environment, is shown here. This is just a rough bar graph from a coastal pond in Falmouth showing just total numbers of infauna, animals living in the bottom of that bay. Just population size versus month of the year, February, April, May, June, and then nothing. July, August, September, and then they start coming in again. Well, they don't go away. They live there all the time. I mean, clams, except for maybe scallops, don't swim, so why aren't they there? And the simple thing that's going on here is that the animals settle, the larvae settle, and they start to grow in this environment through the winter and into the spring, and in summertime, we have these transient oxygen events and the population is decimated. What that means is, and this is an extreme case, I admit, but the point of this is that we're not talking about things like coliform contamination where the animals are there and they are fat and happy, and in fact the clams are happier than anything that there's coliforms there because you can't dig them. So they're saying, hey, this is great, predation's cut down. They're happy, but so what you've done is it's a regulatory problem, it's a human problem. In this case, it's a habitat problem, and what you're looking at is destruction of large expanses of habitat, either directly for shellfish use and colonization and growth, or for the feeding of bottom fish to eat those animals and pass it up the food chain into my barbecue, well, or something. All right. Well, there's two features. It's not, again, just as simple as nitrogen gets rid of animals, or even nitrogen produces plants, and then the plants die, and you lower the oxygen conditions, and then the oxygen conditions kill the animals. It's a little bit more complex than that, because there are two factors which moderate the impacts of nitrogen in an environment. And the first is shown here. It's just a very simple cartoon to indicate that single units of nitrogen entering in through groundwater into a coastal pond, when they enter in, if the flushing rate is very, very high, the nitrogen will enter in. These are supposed to represent phytoplankton. They'll take that nitrogen up right away. And in fact, most of our coastal ponds have very low levels of nitrate in them, even though that is the dominant form of nitrogen entering them from the land. It's very low concentrations because as soon as it gets in there, the phytoplankton take it right up and bang, they grow. And so you're looking at then particulate organic carbon and nitrogen in this case. Well, if it's very well flushed, they take it up and boom, they're flushed out into the, say, Vineyard Sound or Buzzards Bay. In terms of this embayment, they've had no impact whatsoever. It doesn't matter. You can dump, in this example, you can dump tons of nitrogen into this environment. it's not going to have an effect because, again, it's not the nitrogen, it's not even the plants, it is the death of the plants and the consumption of oxygen, which would be in a more poorly flushed environment, which is shown here. And more reasonably, what happens in our coastal ponds throughout southeastern Mass is that nitrogen comes in and it's taken up by phytoplankton. But the phytoplankton are cooking down trying to get out to Vineyard Sound or Buzzards Bay. They can't get there. They die first, or they're eaten and they fall to the bottom and they decay. And when they decay, this process takes up nitrogen. It takes up oxygen. And it releases nitrogen, just like your compost heap in your backyard. You take your leaves and your clippings, you throw them in the compost heap, you let them rot for a while. You take that material back, you throw it in your garden goes great. What has happened is that bacteria have broken down the organic matter in those clippings and released the inorganic nitrogen, which then fertilizes your garden when you put that compost on it. Well, those same processes are what go on in the bottoms of our coastal ponds. The problem is that they also consume oxygen, which in your compost heap isn't that big of a problem, but in our coastal ponds it is. And most of the time what happens in our coastal ponds is you'll have 1 unit of nitrogen come in, grow some phytoplankton, they'll die, nitrogen will go out, this will consume oxygen, grow some more phytoplankton, these will die, that'll consume some oxygen, release some nutrients, and then out. So you get a magnification. And if this stretches out 5, 10 times, then that means that you have cycled the same unit of nitrogen has consumed oxygen every time the thing has hit the ground. So in an abatement where it cycles twice versus an abatement where it cycles 4 times, the same, say, number of septic tanks in the watershed of the one where it cycles twice versus 4 times, and the one where it cycles 4 times, it's as if there were twice as many septic tanks. And the last thing that we have to worry about in our ponds in terms of messing up our nice models is the fact that our ponds tend to import oxygen from the atmosphere. You tend to think of plants as producing oxygen. They do. You tend to think of the ocean as producing oxygen for the atmosphere. It does. But in reality, in our coastal ponds, our ponds tend to import large amounts of oxygen from the atmosphere in the summertime through just normal wind-driven mixing, and that controls the water column oxygen concentration. Of course, respiration takes it up. Photosynthesis produces it. Sediment respiration takes it up. But this is a major source, if not the major source, of oxygen in nighttime. Well, what messes that up is stratification. And what stratification is the way that oxygen mixes in the atmosphere as wind blows across the surface water moves and mixes, and oxygen is incorporated into the water as it mixes. It's the same thing as if you put, say, fresh water on top of salt water in a cup and you try to blow across the top, or what the example I like is if I put cold cream in the bottom of my coffee cup and put coffee on top, the cream will stay on the bottom and the lighter coffee will stay on the top. That happens in our coastal ponds, and when that happens is you get this light layer on top and a heavy layer on the bottom, and if the wind is not strong enough to mix it, just like me trying to blow across the top of my cup and mix that cream, if you can't mix it, then the oxygen can't get to the bottom. And that is a major problem. That's the other major problem in our ponds. And the way that it functions is that for oyster pond, for instance, these are cross sections through 3 of our ponds here, green pond, little pond, and oyster pond. What these are is if you stand and you cut the pond the long way and you peel it back and you look sideways, Vineyard Sound is out here, and this is the depth cross section of the pond. You can see green pond, little pond, great ponds, Bourne's pond, parts of Wacoit, large sections of the embayments in Buzzards Bay all look like this. They run about 1.5 meters to 2 meters deep. But we have some kettle ponds like Oyster Pond. And it is this depth, not us, not anything else, it is this depth which makes it very difficult for the wind to mix this fully all the time. The wind mixes these straight from top to bottom, but it can't mix it down to 6 meters. The result of that is they tend to be stratified. The bottom water that's shown in red here tends not to mix in Oyster Pond or Salt Pond in parts of Wacoit. The result of that non-mixing is that this red area is real data to represent this area of the pond is anaerobic in Oyster Pond. There's no oxygen in the bottom of Oyster Pond in the summertime due to the fact that the wind blowing across the top can only mix the water this much. It can't mix it all the way down there. And so that the entire bottom in these basins of Oyster Pond is not usable for animal habitat. And parts of Salt Pond are not usable as animal habitat. And what we don't want to have happen is other parts of other ponds happening. And this is just what Oyster Pond looks like in map view. This is that same red in the summertime, red area. And it gives you an idea of the scale of the problem. It is this area, fully half of the total bottom area of Oyster Pond, because it stratifies, not because it's heavy in nutrient loading, not because it has this low flushing rate necessarily, but because it stratifies, over half of the area of Oyster Pond is unusable for benthic habitat by animals in the summertime at present. The last slide here, to give you a little hope, you take all that information, you try to break it down, okay, what do we do? That's what you guys are going to tell me. But what we can do, there's only 3 ways you can decrease the negative impacts in our coastal embayments. You can don't put any nutrients in or cut down on the nutrient inputs. That's an obvious one, but probably the hardest one to do. You can increase the rate of tidal flushing, which means you can increase the circulation, you can decrease those bouncing balls, the magnification. That's been done, for instance, in Little Pond and in Green Pond and in Bourne's Pond already. And you can decrease stratification, which is much harder to do, but is one of the things that we're attempting to do now in Oyster Pond. We can't lower its depth, although I always put basin configuration in here because I always threaten to fill it in. But the truth is that by changing salinity stratification through water management, it's a new tool that scientists are giving managers. If we can control the salinity of some of these coastal ponds, we can just manage the stratification, and then without changing a house, changing an inlet, or changing anything else, we can improve the habitat. So that is an incredibly fast view, but it is a very complex subject of some of the problems that we're facing today.
Thanks, Brian. I'd like to take questions until the end, so all the panelists can get to speak. Thanks, Brian, for giving a very nice overview of the scientific aspects of the eutrophication issue. Our next speaker, when he does, will try to put a policy perspective and how policymakers use the scientific information.
No? Which? Oh, there it is. Thanks. Hi, I'm very happy to be here tonight. I'm going to be a little bit disjointed, but I have a perfect excuse because I didn't have much time to prepare. I'm going to say a few things that have to do with what Brian just talked about, and also I have a few things to say that will relate to what Red is going to talk about, but mainly what I want to just talk about, because it has to do with my own position at Wacoit Bay. As the research translator, I sit right in between the scientists who are thinking about problems and the policymakers who want an answer. And I just want to talk about that because it's where I sit all the time, and I want to talk about what some of those problems are. But first of all, just to fill in some of the other things that were said before, when Brian was saying, yes, it's us, it's our problem, this has to do with what I suspect Rhett will be talking about. And my overheads, a lot of them come from Ivan Valiela's lab, and they're not cited because I just didn't have time. But I think this is one of Ivan's. But this is just showing us that, in fact, we like to live right on the water, and this is one of the problems that we have. The populations of coastal counties are higher than in other parts, and that is true. On the Cape, you see that a lot. You see it in Wacoit Bay. I think this is part of Childs River. Everyone likes to live right next to the water. So, and you can find this, as Brian was saying, all over the world. So, and what we find also all over the world, and this is from Ivan Valiela's lab also, is that the more people you have living in a coastal watershed, the more nitrogen that you will have. So it's not just here, as Brian said. This is a global problem, and it is caused by nitrogen. So what happens is, as Brian discussed, we have a problem with too much nitrogen. It's causing all kinds of problems in our coastal ecosystems. And what do? We're unhappy. We don't have the scallops. We don't have the fish. People are clamoring and yelling and saying, do something. We turn to the scientists and we say, please help us. There's too much nitrogen. Where does it come from? How do we get rid of it? What do we do? Well, this really opens a can of worms, because what happens is scientists think a certain way. And so I would just like to look at this with you for a little bit and talk about how this just, it's not that we don't solve the problem, but sometimes our time frame is so different that it just takes us a long time. So if you think of, we as citizens, we get so frustrated both with the scientists and the policymakers. What do scientists do? They do research. They like to think about problems. They like to think about issues. And a policymaker wants to make a decision. Their time frames. A scientist wants to figure it out, so it takes as long as it takes to figure it out. While a policymaker wanted the answer yesterday. This is a problem. What are their goals? A scientist, and it's important to understand that they need to think this way in order to do their jobs properly, both the scientists and the policymakers. So the scientist wants to increase understanding, while the policymaker wants to fix an immediate problem. Again, he wants to do it yesterday. The scientist is interested only in scientific evidence. That's the only thing that matters. The policymaker has to take all kinds of things into consideration: economics, public opinion, the values that people have. What do they expect? A scientist is never happy. He never understands it completely. There's always something more. The policymaker wants a straight answer. Their focus. A scientist will focus very narrowly on a problem. A policymaker looks at the big picture. And finally, their worldview is very different. The scientist is interested in biological, physical, and chemical mechanisms, whereas the policymaker has to be interested in society, economic considerations, and political considerations. So I think this really shows us where we have some of this tension, and I certainly feel it in my position. These two groups of people who think very differently need to work together. And they have worked together very successfully, especially, as Brian was saying, in southeastern Massachusetts. Let's look at how that works just a little bit. And again, Brian really covered a lot of this. Here again, it's just a different way of looking at what Brian was talking about. What a scientist, if we think about it, we can think of everything that Brian talked about and put it all in one picture. And these are all of the things that a scientist has to deal with before he can go to the policymaker and say, okay, here's what we think. So if we have a septic system, we have to know how many houses do we have, how big is the watershed, what's the hydrology like, how much nitrogen comes out of a septic system, where does it go, how does it travel, how fast does it travel, are some systems better than other systems, what kind do people have, what's the hydrology of the area, what's the water table like, how much nitrogen is coming from precipitation, how about dry deposition, which isn't up here, how much gets taken back up, how much goes through. So there are, and then as Brian said, at the sediment water interface, what's happening there, and then all of the problems that you have once in the water. In order to figure out how much nitrogen is too much nitrogen, you have to understand the ecology of the receiving waters as well. So, and again, this is just very fast and kind of filling in with Brian. The scientists will collect field data and also construct mathematical models on all of these issues. What is the land use? And there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty that's attached to every single one of the kinds of data that scientists have to collect in order to get a handle on what's really happening. So they will make models about the watershed, the land use, the water, the nutrients, the hydrology, ecological models, what's happening at the sediment water interface, nutrient transformations, what's happening in the water that will finally mean that this is the amount of nitrogen that is too much nitrogen. So attached to all of these problems that individually need to be solved and put together in a model for management is a tremendous amount of uncertainty. And it's that uncertainty that makes the scientist want to step back and say, I'm not ready yet to discuss this or to make a recommendation. Just to give you some examples about the kinds of uncertainty, and again, you could find these and attach these to all the data that's collected. If you just look at the range of values that you'll get from septic tank effluent anywhere, this is 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, I think. So the range of efficiency of a particular septic tank can range anywhere from 10 to 90%. So that means that your confidence intervals around any mean that you have can be quite broad. And the same is true for these other. This is all data that's collected from septic systems that are on sandy soils, much like we have here. But that is just an example of the kind of uncertainty that's attendant on all of these. And so, of course, this brings us back to our problem, the dilemma, which is that scientists want to speak in terms of probabilities, while the regulators need to speak in terms of certainties because they have to make laws and regulations. And what we hope, and what we in fact see here quite successfully, is that it seems that folks have adopted the precautionary principle. The scientists are willing to forego some uncertainty, and the policymakers are willing to accept some uncertainty so that we have been able to move forward. And you can see that, for instance, the Buzzards Bay Project, who's had a mission to come up with a management plan for Buzzards Bay, has a nitrogen loading model that accounts for nitrogen inputs from various kinds of land uses. Their model outputs a nitrogen load. They then take that nitrogen load and, along with citizens' data and information on flushing rates, is that right? Yeah. On flushing rates and some state water quality goals, have come up with a way to get a handle on a critical load of nitrogen for all of their embayments. And their database is being added to all the time as they move forward with this work. At the same time, the Cape Cod Commission also has a nitrogen loading model that's quite similar. And in some cases, they also have adapted the Buzzards Bay Project's tiered loading limits in order to determine what is too much nitrogen for an embayment. So in all of these cases, it has meant a melding of science and the needs of policymakers to come up with some of these planning tools. As these models go forward, there are other models that are in progress. The Wacoit Bay Land Margin Ecosystem Research Project has been developing models that are looking at nitrogen in the Wacoit Bay watershed with applications to other watersheds, and that model is being ground truthed right now. And along with that, one of the things that we didn't talk about earlier, but that does have something to do with this whole problem, is that, of course, groundwater takes some time to travel. And I'm going to end with this because this kind of, I assume, will have something to do with land use planning that Rhett will talk about, because as we develop our town and put more and more houses in places, if they're far from the water, it's going to take a while, but that nitrogen is nonetheless going to end up in our coastal ponds also. So land use planning for the long term is exceedingly important. This is some work that Chiho Sham and John Brawley did at the Cadmus Group, and I believe it used Joe Costa's nitrogen loading coefficients just for septic systems, and looked at what would happen if you stopped all development. And you can see that because of the travel time of groundwater, the nitrogen load takes much longer to taper off. This work has been furthered by some efforts by a graduate student, Glennis Collins, who's worked with Jim Kramer, and she has looked at land use changes over time from the turn of the century and has incorporated agriculture and atmospheric deposition as well as septic system inputs into a time travel model as well, which also may be further modified by additional work from Cadmus. So I'll stop there, leaving you with, I hope, again, racing along here, just some more understanding of the natural tension that there is between policymakers and scientists, and how very, very complicated the issue is for the scientist to get a handle on it and let go of some uncertainty while the policymaker agrees to accept some uncertainty. Thank you.
Right into the next speaker. So our next speaker will be Brett, who will talk about the town issues.
I would say David could go next. As a public official, I always like to talk after the citizen, of course.
Okay, well, we can so
It's up to you, though, David, if you want.
Okay, but it's okay by me.
I'm a politician. So David,
No problem.
we'll talk about the citizens' perspective.
We discussed that back and forth and concluded between the two of us that, well, it just, we take it the way it fell. Thanks, Rhett. Anyway, let me ask you quickly this. How many of you live on the seashore? How many of you live within a mile of the seashore? 5 miles. 10 miles. Anybody live further than 10 miles? Pardon?
I said, not on the Cape.
Not on the Cape. That's all right. What are you doing here? You come to the wrong meeting.
I said, no, I meant nobody should live more than 5 miles on the Cape.
You're right. Good. Then we all have one significant issue to deal with. Your quality of life, my quality of life, your real estate values, my real estate values, what's going to happen to my kids with this property, what's going to happen to your kids and what's going to happen to you is significantly at risk, and it is significantly at risk today, not tomorrow, not 3 years from now, but today. We have the great good fortune to live in a place where we have immense scientific value. So why haven't the problems yet been solved? Because they haven't. You've heard from two major experts. It's what I choose to call the Nero sanction. We fiddle while Rome burns. What do I mean by fiddling? I don't know how long you've been here on the Cape. We've been fortunate to have property here since the early 60s. And we have the great good, God-blessed fortune to live on a bluff at the north end of Wacoit Bay. We look out across that bay, and we've had property on the bay for years. In the early 60s, those of you who may have kept track, there were 10,000 bushels of scallops taken out of Wacoit Bay annually, and last year there might have been 300. Now, all during this period, ladies and gentlemen, there have been erudite discussions like this evening, not to the precise measurement. Maggie's right, scientists need precise measurements. Personally, I don't want a scientist that doesn't want a precise measurement. I don't need rough opinions, I've got those. So I look to the scientists for those. But while that's happening, Rome is burning. Scallops are down from 10,000 to 300, and there are example after example after example of what's going on. How many of you in this room don't believe that nitrogen overloading is one of the major problems that we have? Do you need yet to be convinced? How many of you think that dumping toilet water into swimming water, into drinking water, is a bad idea? That's been no mystery for several hundreds of years, if not more. I've got a simple mind.
Hold on.
Yes, sir.
You said about pouring water into the drinking water.
Yes.
That's, as a public health official, which I was, now
Right.
retired.
Yeah.
Since age, one of the fundamentals of getting rid of pollution
Yes.
is dilution.
Right.
Fluid dilution.
Right.
Now, what are you going to do with it?
Right. You're going to dump it. But you got to get the nitrogen out of it, correct?
I don't know.
Well, that's what
According to this, according to Mr. Howes, it
Yeah.
wasn't nitrogen, it was also oxygen.
What he was saying, if I heard him correctly, was that nitrogen overload starts with it. And eventually that takes care of phytoplankton.
No, he said that.
Correct or incorrect?
Excess nitrogen would not be, if you had flow through water and other things. It was a combination, am I right or wrong? But
It's nitrogen and
I'm
oxygen.
74 years old, maybe I'm senile.
No, that's right. I mean, it's the level of nitrogen that causes the problem is determined by the specific environment, and if you can add as much nitrogen until you start to see the oxygen drop. In simple terms, that's...
So we agree that we start with nitrogen and oxygen is part of the problem. Are we in agreement on that? Are we also in agreement that dumping toilet water into drinking water is not a good idea?
No, we don't agree on that.
Okay, then I'll rest with the fact that we don't agree on that. I don't want to drink water at your house, but that's okay. It's okay. It's all right. It's okay. And quickly, we understand, as though we don't have to continue with some of the questions, that septic systems and fertilizer and runoff and other things cause these problems. This same kind of discussion by the scientists was held at least 15 years ago that I personally know about by Ivan Valiela at the Wacoit Bay Yacht Club. What am I trying to say? We need to act while at the same time, in conjunction with the scientists moving towards definitive answers. We need to act. What are some of the problems? We know about them. Pollution, dead fish, poor swimming quality, on and on and on. They don't have to be reiterated. But if you have any question at all about my statement that your real estate values are at risk, then go visit John's Pond, which is a different kind of pollution. It's from the Otis Air Force Base. We happened to rent a place there for about a year while we built a house. And every other house practically had a real estate sign in front of you, and real estate values were down something like 40%. And if you want a hard job, try and sell property on John's Pond, and the quality of life is there. What are some of the solutions? The solutions, somebody once said, and I think it was well put, that there is no such thing as being away from the pollution. Even though you may live maybe a mile away or 10 miles away or whatever. Let me just briefly give you a sense. And one of the things that I will submit at the end of these brief comments is that what is at risk here and should be involved here is your own vested self-interest. This is not a hypothetical discussion, ladies and gentlemen. This is your quality of life, that of your kids, your values, and other things of that nature. One of the things that affects me, one of the reasons I'm involved with FACES, one of the reasons I'm chairman of the National Wildlife Refuge Friends Group, and a variety of other things, CPWB, et cetera, et cetera. People say, it's wonderful for you to do these things. I said, look, it's in my vested best interest. Here's Wacoit Bay, that's where I live. That's on the coastal. Yes, the coastal is important. But as you probably all know, up comes the down. Water seeks its own level. Like I say, I only know some of the simple principles. So the stuff that's up here in Otis Air Force Base and all the pollution that gets dumped into these areas that comes down into these streams, comes down into Wacoit Bay. Net bottom line, there is no such place as a way. We have to be concerned not only what happens on the coast, but also in the upland. We not only have to be concerned about the short term, but also about the long term. What are some of the things we can do? We can evaluate specific septic systems. There's a lot of wonderful work going on at Webner, at Buzzards Bay and others, but I'm told that the RUC system is the only system that really removes nitrogen from the system. Now that may be wrong, but the point is that if there's some systems in addition to the RUC system, then good. Let's look at them, because Title V, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, does not really remove an awful lot of nitrogen. Is that correct? And everybody's paralyzed about Title V. So let's look at that issue. What can we do about fertilizer? Well, for example, don't fertilize your lawn before it rains. That's one of the things that we can do today, not 3 years from now or 5 years from now when everything else has gone to blazes. Get runoff systems in your towns and get those runoff systems from the roads and get plantings around them. It'll reduce runoff. Study and impact town facilities. Press your town people for improved water systems. Go to information meetings like this, but then do something about it. Don't just nod your heads and cluck your things and go home and do nothing. We've got to act, and we've got to act now. Get involved. Here are some of the organizations you can get involved with, for example. The Wildlife Refuge. Why am I involved in the Wildlife Refuge? Because there's 5,800 acres of land there. 3,200 is not developed, and every acre of land we take off the market that is not developed, that means one less piece of property that generates nitrogen. That's one solution. FACES, the group that was just talked about. It's a terrific organization. Get involved in your own town associations. The BU Marine Program and other facilities here in Woods Hole. Support what they're doing. Take a look at Webner. Webner does some superb things. Support their programs and get involved. Get involved with CPWB. Now, if we understand all of these things, as obviously this group does, and others do, then why? What are we waiting for? I think that this is part of the problem. And I think it really characterizes the problem. Actually, we have this drawing with this ostrich's eyes open, and that's the good news. Because he can see what's underneath the sand, and it stinks, and it's coming towards our water. Finally, what do I think is one of the problems? And what do I think we can do about it? By getting involved in these various things and demanding action now. Two things. Specifically, I think the problem is that the scientific process and the regulatory process, scientists need to struggle for answers, says Maggie, and the regulators need to get the right answers, and regulators are oftentimes politicians, and they don't like to tee us off, they don't like to tell us bad news. And furthermore, we don't like to change. I don't like to spend money for things that, I don't see any more than you do. And so I think there's a self-reinforcing process that takes place. While we can say, well, the scientists, after all, haven't got the answers yet. When we get the answers, we'll do something about it. In the meantime, thousands and thousands of scallops die. I'm now told the fish, authoritatively, that within 2 to maybe 5 years, it's entirely possible the Rockaway Bay could be a bog. Because of, I think it's phytoplankton, is it phytoplankton? Whatever. I don't have a scientific answer on that. But that it could be if the pollution continues. So I think what we've got to do is two things. One is recognize that while we look to the scientists and we look to the regulators, it is us, and we have to solve the problem, and we have to go to our towns and our groups and insist that something get done. Number one, I'd like to see a group of citizens get together and really focus on this septic system issue and get some immediate and further action on it that can be definitive. And if anybody wants to be involved in that, let me know. But I think, to wind it up, the benefits, ladies and gentlemen, are the quality of life that you have for your children and for yourselves. And it's not Brian that's going to solve those problems for us. And it's not Maggie. And it's not even Rhett, although Rhett will have some solutions. It's us, and thank you very much.
Okay, now our wrap-up speaker.
Now, Rhett, tell us what you're going to do.
See why I waited? Well, I think David issued some exciting challenges, and I am happy to say that, well, we got to move this first, right? That there is an awful lot happening at Falmouth in this regard. And I'll talk a little bit about what's happening with our local comprehensive plan. But he also mentioned a few sort of buzzwords in my field, which is planning, and those were vested interests or vested rights, and some other issues that come up in a different context, I think, than what David was talking about. And I had my conversations about our regulatory approach and zoning and aspects of regulating land use. I think those are particularly important and indicative of, or part of the problem. I've been Falmouth's assistant town planner for 4 years, and I could say I've really enjoyed working with all of you. I'm sorry I'm leaving in some ways. But in that position, I've been sort of in the front line, I guess, or one or two of the Falmouth staff people dealing with the regulations that affect the coastal ponds. It's been an extremely eye-opening experience. If you believe what Brian says about the fact that residential development is a nitrogen input problem, and you wonder why we have a problem, and I don't think you do, I encourage you to come down and take a look at this map that's on the wall. Maybe you can do it after we're done. It's so far away, I'm sure most of you can't see it. If you can, or when you do get a chance, let me just briefly run through it. It's a map produced by Geographic Information System, and it queries shows all the parcels in town, and it shows them based on their land use. Anything shown in yellow is a residential use. And from those of you in the back sure can't see it, but all the yellow is right like this, right along the coastal margin. And I do encourage you to come take a look. I think it's a revealing image. In the world of planning, we sort of categorize our options or our solutions into two areas. One of them is regulatory, that involves planning board subdivision regulations, zoning, conservation commissions, and board of health. And the other is non-regulatory. And we've sort of been dealing with both of those. Non-regulatory includes acquisition of property or acquisition of land, either by buying it outright or by buying a restriction, a conservation easement. We have the advantage in dealing with coastal issues to have another non-regulatory solution, which we've seen happen in Falmouth. The example is the widening of an inlet in Bourne's Pond, or the increase in the size of the culvert in Little Pond. Both of those have had significant impact or improvement on water quality in that pond. And I would point to those as solutions to some of the problems where a regulatory answer doesn't always work. And I'll always encourage land acquisition, as Mr. Palmer did, as probably the single most effective way to limit development and limit nitrogen loading. Let me just give you a little bit of history. The town has had a very active role, I believe, in coastal planning and in its approach towards preserving coastal water quality. We recognized the problem very early. If you look back to the planning documents in Falmouth, early in the 1970s, this was discussed and has been recognized as a problem. 1983, my limited knowledge would tell me that the first regulation regarding coastal bylaw, coastal regulation of land uses was enacted in Falmouth. The Planning Board enacted a subdivision control regulation which required developers who were developing land in coastal pond recharge areas, which I'll show you in this slide right here, to submit environmental impact statements regarding the effect of their development on water quality in the coastal pond. I think fairly self-explanatory. Point Bay is here, Falmouth Harbor is over here. The heavy lines that you see are the extent of the coastal, the recharge area to the coastal ponds. I'm going to show you another slide in a few minutes about how those lines need to change, and that's one thing we're working on. Of course, if you enact a regulation under subdivision control, it's not as effective as you might think it should be. And the reason is that subdivision control under the planning board is meant to establish standards for how wide your street should be, or how deep your utilities should be, or what type of drainage should be in place on a road. It doesn't deal particularly well with protecting coastal water quality. So the next step was to take a standard that was established in 1983 and turn it into a zoning bylaw. And that's what happened in 1988. Again, this map was adopted as the official zoning map, establishing recharge areas. And this time we required developers in these areas over 5 lots or over 5 acres to submit an environmental impact statement or take mitigating precautions against nitrogen loading. In other words, decrease the number of lots in your subdivision, install denitrifying septic systems, limit the number of bedrooms, or no lawn area, something like that. Falmouth has taken that step in 1980. It became a much stronger bylaw at that point because the planning board had the authority to compel a developer to do it. It's been challenged a couple times in court. Pieces of it have been taken away because the judge said you can't do that, but it's still in place and it's still active today. If a developer comes in tomorrow, wants to subdivide property in one of those recharge areas, they will approach me and I'll say, this is what you're going to have to expect, what you will expect when you approach the planning board for its approval. I can tell you now that in the beginning days, all the developers prepared environmental impact statements, and they were asked to measure the impact of their development on the water quality in the particular pond. Well, what did all these reports say? No impact. We're not going to affect it. We're not going to push it over the eutrophic level. We're not going to have to take any steps. Well, we know what the status of the coastal ponds is today, thanks to Brian and thanks to the Pond Watchers group. All the developers that are coming in today aren't preparing EISs because we won't let them. Because we twist their arms a little bit. They're taking the mitigating steps right up front. I've probably seen maybe 10 or 12 subdivisions in the 4 years I've been here in these coastal pond districts, and all of them have installed, to one degree or another, these denitrifying septic systems. And that's a good, it is working in that effect. It's also nice to know now that the standard or the condition that we apply that they do install these septic systems, now they can actually do it because DEP is going to let them do it. When the conditions first started coming through in 1986 and 1988, there was no way to do it. There was a condition sitting out there on a subdivision plan. They can't comply. What do they do now? Those are the types of things that get planning boards in trouble. And now, thankfully, DEP has become flexible enough so that these systems, which do work to certain degrees, not 100%, can be installed, and that's a good sign. Has the bylaw been successful? Well, I think it has. One reason is it's raised the consciousness level. It's raised the awareness. The developers expect to have to do this now. They don't expect to have to do it in Mashpee or Barnstable or other towns that don't have it. Well, maybe Mashpee and Barnstable do, but in other towns that have the same problem that we do, they don't have to do this. I think that's effective. They've had to do more than the minimum because we've said it's important. I also think that we've anticipated to a certain degree the changes that have come forth in Title V. In other words, we've kind of forced these guys to come up with innovative systems. We have the condition out there. It says you have to comply. The market economy provides. There's a market for it because the planning board says you got to put one in. And I think that's important too. Has it served to reduce the total amount of nitrogen in these ponds? A little bit. Not completely. And we'll talk about that briefly in a minute, the reasons why. The other sort of interesting aspect which ties into Brian's research, which he told us is the important connection between the scientist and the policymaker, is that back when the bylaw was established in '88, there were standards established for each one of the ponds for a goal for water quality. There were 3 categories of areas. You can probably correct me, Brian. It's intense water use areas, which are areas, for instance, south of the Green Pond Bridge. Lots of moorings, lots of boats, lots of activity. The standard for water quality there was set at 0.75 milligrams per liter, between 5 and 0.75 milligrams per liter. In other areas, which we called stabilization areas, areas where we recognized that there was a mix of uses, shellfishing, habitat, swimming, and other aspects, the category was less than 5 parts per million. And then in our high-quality areas, the standard was 0.32 parts per million. And what we've learned over the period of time of the research, and Brian's been telling us this, that those were pretty good estimates. That they don't work for every pond because every pond is different, but we established planning goals, and through the series of monitoring and feedback, we find out that those are pretty good goals. I'm going to now tell you what the limitations are in the bylaw, because it has limitations. One of which is all limitations inherent to zoning. And now we're getting to this vested interest issue. Any subdivision approved prior to the acceptance or enactment of this bylaw is exempt, period. All those lots out there in those large areas of town, coastal pond overlay districts, they're exempt, period. They don't have to comply. And how many of them are there out there? Somewhere in the vicinity of 3,000. 1980s was a happy time for subdividers. There's an awful lot of vacant lots out there which are now buildable, and they're not subject to the conditions of the coastal pond overlay district. So those are the people that we would be asked to regulate if this bylaw was to change. And that's difficult from a private property rights point of view. It's also very difficult, as we've just come out of town meeting, to recognize the effect of some of these changes to bylaws and how difficult it is to get town meeting to vote on. The bylaw also only affects lots greater than 5 acres in size. There are an awful lot of others out there that are smaller and that are being subdivided all the time. Another criticism has been that we didn't use a mass balance approach, meaning that we didn't calculate the carrying capacity of the water body and then establish our zoning density based on the carrying capacity. Yeah, that would have been the way to do it, but it was almost too late for some of these ponds because they're already subdivided. If we were to establish a minimum lot size for Green Pond, all the land left there to be subdivided would get one house on it because the minimum lot size would be so big to take up for the amount of nitrogen that's already there. So that's a difficult issue. The map is wrong. Plain and simple. 1984, we established this map. At the time, the best available technology gave us those lines, and that is the best thing as of 1984. Let me show you what the Cape Cod Commission tells us should be there in 1996. This is a much bigger picture, you'll notice, and by the way, the hatching is really just there for contrast. Falmouth is down here, and as always the case, or often the case, we always chop off Woods Hole because it's always hanging out there. This is Wacoy Bay, Green Pond, Great Pond, Falmouth Harbor. This is the town boundary at Bourne, Falmouth and Bourne. Way up at the ceiling is the top of the aquifer somewhere on a Mass Military Reservation. Just for contrast, we'll put the other one back up, although you've probably been looking at it. The top of the watershed for, say, for instance, Great Pond is right there. New science tells us that it's 17 miles north of there. Okay? So now what are we going to do? Now we've incorporated a vastly larger amount of space in Falmouth. That map has to go to town meeting. What are the 260-something town meeting members going to say when we tell them, now we're not only regulating you guys, but we're regulating you guys too? That's a difficult sell. So one of the issues, that just for clarification over here, once again, there's a big void also on the Buzzards Bay side, isn't there? Not one district on Buzzards Bay side. And I'm not even going to get into why there isn't one there. But West Falmouth Harbor, that's a nitrogen-sensitive embayment. Does it have a district? No. It also has a wastewater treatment plant. Other limitations, let's see. We're requiring denitrifying septic systems now. How well do they work is a good question. Some say they denitrify 40%. I think that's a DEP standard per se, one of the approved versions. Some say more. It's probably not important what it is. But what these systems all rely on something more than just the normal Title V system. The normal Title V system works on gravity. You flush the toilet, down it goes, off it goes, you can forget about it. These things run on electricity. They require lots of maintenance. What happens when they unplug the thing? Your planning board just approved a new house or a new subdivision based on a denitrifying septic system. Health inspector goes down there and says, yep, it's turned on, it's working. They move in and they shut it off. Now what? All that planning isn't doing any good. So there's a very, very, very important monitoring issue with these new new alternative systems for denitrification. That's a limitation to the bylaw. Okay, now I'm going to jump a little bit into some of the non-regulatory approaches. And don't get me wrong, the limitations are there, but I think we've gone in the right direction with our regulatory approach. The non-regulatory approach, town meeting and the electorate has constantly supported land purchases for lots of different reasons. But as everybody recognizes, the advantage to a coastal pond for the land purchase is really significant. It may also have importance for conservation or for habitat or other values, but it has an important impact on those recharge areas. I'll put that up there just for fun. The town has also funded the necessary research and ultimately the implementation of some of the solutions. And I've given a couple examples already. I think the Bournes Pond inlet, though, Brian will tell us that there wasn't any before data there to know whether we did the right size of inlet. That has had a good impact on water quality in Bournes Pond. That data does tell us that. The change in the culverts in Little Pond. I don't know that the data is actually back on whether that's been as hopeful or as hoped, but I think you will see some improvement there. Town meeting approved, I think, $10,000. Got a grant for another 17 and funded a flushing study for West Falmouth Harbor, solely for the purpose of understanding what the carrying capacity is to West Falmouth Harbor so we could come up with a management solution. Town meeting funded that. Oyster Pond. I didn't go to the second night of town meeting, but Carl, did you get funded for the Oyster Pond stuff?
Yes, blanket vote.
Blanket vote. Funded another, I think, was it $20,000? Yes. Not just for studying, but for an actual implementation solution to the problems in Oyster Pond. And year after year, town meeting has funded the Falmouth Pond Watchers with a significant amount of money. And it became such a rote vote that we put it in a line item in the planning board's budget. So now there's money going every year for pond watchers to continue the monitoring. Another non-regulatory approach. We have been going for as many grants as we can to clean up stormwater discharge, direct discharges from streets. Not always a recognized source of nitrogen. It also solves other important problems related to fecal coliform and opening of shellfish beds. We've taken that approach too. I think the next step is to move into what happens next. The local comprehensive planning process. I think Mr. Palmer encouraged you all to get involved. I'll add another place for you to get involved. Call the planning office. Call Dorinda Osterman, who's the chairperson of the local planning committee, and become involved in the process of determining the future of management solutions in the coastal ponds. There is now, in preparation, a water resources element to the local comprehensive plan, and it establishes some goals for water quality. What do we want to see the water look like? What standards are we going to establish? And what are we going to do about it? And one of our objectives is to establish a specific management strategy for each pond, because we recognize that each pond is going to be different. It's still in progress. You can get involved, you can read drafts, you can come to the meetings. I encourage you to get even more involved in that. If you know something about this, come on in, offer to do some writing, because that's where the committee needs its help. It's a volunteer-driven process. A staff of people of two, myself formerly, and Brian Curry up in the planning office are doing most of the work. And we're not hiring a consultant to tell us what to do, we're relying on you guys to do it. I think that it may not, the plan itself may not give specific solutions to each pond, but it'll establish an agenda so that we do set in motion a process that we can establish some solutions. Where we know a problem exists, we need to act now. So the planning board is getting involved and talking about what changes need to happen to the Coastal Pond Overlay District. They're talking about expanding the map to include West Falmouth Harbor, or to include the farther reaches of Hatchville up to the town line into our water resource on Coastal Pond District. They're also working with the Board of Health. Another regulatory solution is offered through Title V, which is I believe the term is the nitrogen management, I'm sorry, nitrogen sensitive abatements. Title V establishes the authority for local bylaws acting under Title V to apply a higher standard if a recharge area is designated as a special area for nitrogen management. They can apply a standard of 440 gallons per day per acre, which means that basically, if you have an acre lot, you get 4 bedrooms and that's it. Planning board loves that approach because we've been trying to get it out of zoning for years, because zoning doesn't give us a right to a clean environment. It gives us the right to enforce regulations for the purpose of public health. And apart from the discussion on sewage and the drinking water, this isn't a public health issue for most of us. So when it goes into the Board of Health realm, now you're talking about a higher authority to act. And I don't see too many Board of Health members here, but they may have a unique perspective on whether or not that's the right way to go. And the planning board is talking to them now to try to get that in motion. Another aspect of what they're working on is to improve our transfer of development rights bylaw. If you have a piece of property and it's located in one of these recharge areas, you have the right today to transfer the right to develop on that property to some other place that isn't as sensitive. That's a great planning tool because it allows the individual to gain equity from their property without having the environmental effect. The difficult thing, of course, is now, where are you going to put it? There isn't a lot of area in Falmouth that's either sewered or that isn't part of one of these coastal pond recharge areas. And those parts that aren't part of that overlay district are part of another one, water resources or wildlife corridor or you name it. So it's a good tool, but it's a difficult one to implement, and we're working on trying to get solutions to that effect. Other tools are offered to us through the Cape Cod Commission. The District of Critical Planning Concern is DCPC, which has been enacted in West Falmouth at the Great Sipwith Marsh and Black Beach area. It's been enacted not for the purpose of managing nitrogen, but for flood control, preserving wildlife habitat, and some other key issues. It allows a local regulatory board to enact regulations free from the burdens of zoning and outside of the issues of vested rights and grandfathering. Modifications to the existing sewage treatment plant. Joe Costa isn't here tonight, but he's been doing a lot of work on what are the management solutions to West Falmouth Harbor. We now have a pretty good handle on what the carrying capacity is. What's the solution? He estimates that 35% of the nitrogen entering that harbor is from the wastewater treatment plant. And he also estimates, I think, that 16 to 20-something% is from residential development. There's another issue in discussion about the old sewage lagoons and the impact that they'll have on that water body. I think you're looking at modifications of that wastewater treatment plant someday. If you want it to expand, you're definitely looking at modifications. There's no doubt about it. And in fact, in the planning board's discussion about whether they should establish a district in West Falmouth Harbor, think of the dilemma there. The planning board wants to regulate private homeowners in that area, responsible for probably 15% of the nitrogen. They're going to tell them they have to install a nitrogen alternative septic system when 35% of it is coming from the public wastewater treatment plant? How's that going to fly at town meeting? Not very well. I think you're looking at modifications to that plant in the fairly near future. Another item that gets thrown out there as a solution, particularly for these peninsulas down here on every side of the ponds, is some sort of neighborhood-sized wastewater treatment plant. Instead of pumping it up to West Falmouth, there are some effective solutions to managing nitrogen more or less on the neighborhood level. And I think those are the kinds of recommendations that you'll probably see come out of the local comprehensive planning process when we determine what the best solution is for each pond. So it does take time, there's no doubt about it. It also takes a tremendous amount of political effort to get these things through. It's not just as easy as saying, this is a great idea, let's go to town meeting and do it. That's where we need to have the answers from the scientists before we go and propose a solution. My boss likes to say that planners create unintended nightmares all the time. I don't think this, even though we need to act as soon as possible, I think we need to act also with the best information and with a set of solutions that have been fully worked out. We understand what the effects are going to be. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure the panelists have lots of questions for one another, but we'll save those so we can open it up to questions from the audience. So please address the person on the panel you want to answer the question. So first.
Dave, I'd like to ask you, do you think that the number of propeller-driven craft in Lockwood Bay system over the years has any effect on keeping the sediments in suspension during very critical periods when larvae invertebrates and other forms of life are trying to make out their cycle?
It apparently has had two effects. One is a bad effect in that it tears up the bottom and provides additional pollution through gas and oil and other things of that nature. On the other hand, there's been a body of thought that says the propeller-driven craft oftentimes do stir things up and keep moving, which is sometimes a good idea, not a bad idea. And that bottom line is whatever the level of the effect, at least what I've been told over the years, is that the net negative effect is relatively small as compared to the other issues that are affecting the water.
Mr. Palmer,
Yes.
we're talking about economics. I don't want this to sound like a battle between us.
It's not.
Talking about economics.
Yeah.
You have a house. You said you had it since 1960.
Yeah, my original home was bought in 1962.
By the Title V, if you're going to sell that house,
Right.
what will it cost you to get a septic system examined and this septic system put in that will qualify you to sell it? $10,000, $5,000, or $35,000?
It's going to cost you a fair amount of money if you still had. I sold that house about 3 years ago, and this issue was not an issue at all. The home that I now own, I completed in April of 15th, 1995.
I'm just saying, you're worried about economics.
Yeah.
My answer is everything in moderation. We passed the laws,
Yeah.
and we said, you can't do this, you can't do that. We sometimes pass it on political, it's just politics, not scientific, and then we find out that 30% of houses on Cape cannot be sold now because of the amount. The owner will say, I'm not going to buy an old house, I'll buy an old house. We have more new houses being built and sold. So I found that 30 houses that have gone on the market for 2 years, yet they're building new houses and selling them before they're completed because of the septic system.
I can't answer definitively your economic analysis, but there is common ground between us, which doesn't surprise me, which is that I think there has to be economic response to some of these issues. And in my particular instance, I can give you an example of what I mean. When we put our new home in, I was trying the best I knew how to be environmentally sensitive because we're on the edge of Lockwood Bay. So I went to one of the local institutions and said, you're experimenting with new septic systems, right? They said, right. I said, they're much better than a lot of other things, right? They said, right. I said, good. I'd be interested in being a test site for one of those. What kind of a deal can you make me? And they said, the deal we can make you is that we'll put in one of these systems and it'll cost something like 40 to 50 and maybe 100% more than the normal system. No, I said, oh, wait a minute, I don't think we understand what I said, but I said, what kind of a deal? Net bottom line, I did not put in one of those new systems, and one of the reasons was it cost too much. I think, sir, that it is important that there be a response to the economic concerns, and I think you're absolutely right.
I have a question for Brian Fogg. First of all, I'd like to compliment the panel on the scope of their presentation, and I think there's cause for thinking for all of us here. We all acknowledge, we're willing to acknowledge that point sources, remote sources of pollution are the important initial factor in the eutrophication